Hey guys, and welcome to Tangle. I'm your host, Isaac Saul, and on today's episode, I'm thrilled to be sitting down with Kyla Scanlon. Kyla is one of the most interesting voices commentating on the economy right now. She is somebody you can find on pretty much every single platform there is, whether it's her Substack newsletter or TikTok or YouTube. And she's doing something I think is really important. She's communicating a lot of economic news to Gen Z in a way that apparently they find quite interesting because her following is huge. And I think it's well-deserved given some of the clarity with which she speaks about this economic moment and some of the issues facing a lot of Americans. So I was thrilled to have her on the show. I encourage you to check out some more of her work if you get the chance. And I hope you guys enjoy the interview. Kyla Scanlon, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I think maybe a good place to start for our audience would just be if you could share a little bit about yourself. You're here. I'll give a little bit of a spoiler to talk about the economy and the current state of things in the United States. So tell us a little bit about how you came to be somebody who comments on the U.S. economy.
Yeah. So I'm from Kentucky originally and then graduated and moved out to LA, worked for a Capital Group for a little while, and then started making videos about the economy. And those kind of took off. And now I'm working on a book about the economy and be able to teach at various universities about the economy and get to talk about the economy online a lot. So yeah, it's super fun.
Yeah, for people who aren't familiar with your work, I mean, I see your stuff all over Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. You have an awesome Substack. I encourage people to go check it out and read it if they're interested in, I think, a unique voice on the current state of things. I did not know you were from Kentucky. I was just in Kentucky last week for the first time. I was giving a speak at Transylvania University in Lexington.
Cool. Yeah.
Love Kentucky. I left a huge fan of rolling hills and horses, and it's beautiful out there.
It's gorgeous. Yeah.
So let's start with, I guess, maybe a simple 30,000 foot question, and probably not an easy question, which is, how would you characterize the current state of the U.S. economy? When someone asks you what the hell's going on right now, what's your answer?
I mean, I think, what the hell is going on is kind of a good way to characterize it. It's pretty confusing. I would say it's very difficult to reconcile certain parts of the economy. So we have inflation going down. We have a relatively strong labor market, but consumer sentiment is just in the tanker. And for good reasons, right? Like wages have been sort of stagnant. We've only seen real wages tick up recently. Inflation is a pressure cooker. So even though it's, going down, it doesn't mean that prices are going down, right? It just means that you're not feeling prices increase as much, but prices still have increased substantially. So I think a lot of people are just feeling pretty tired, feeling pretty frustrated, and that creates a really weird economic environment where it's things are fine. It's like that dog in the burning room, I guess it's kind of the opposite. Like the dog is on fire, but the room is fine.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's sort of, at least from my view, one of the things that's really interesting about this moment is that public sentiment is a lot more tied to my world than yours, I guess, because I'm a political reporter. So I'm very interested in the sort of politics lens while you're looking at the numbers and the data and what's actually happening. And I'm watching President Biden try and sell Bidenomics to the American public. When I'm looking around feeling like people don't feel very good about the economy, this seems like a really stupid political play. So I'm curious, maybe if you could talk a little bit about whether you feel like the public sentiment is divorced from reality or maybe a reflection of reality. I mean, how do you view that?
I mean, this is what everybody has been talking about recently. I published this piece back in July 2022 called The Vibe Session. And that, people did not like that word because of the word vibes. But the idea is that economic sentiment is low despite economic data being okay. So consumer sentiment low, economic data is fine. The vibes are off, right? And so I think, when we're talking about Bidenomics, when we're talking about the economy at large, like number one with Bidenomics, the whole project focused a little bit too much on manufacturing. And the average person doesn't really experience the CHIPS Act on their day-to-day life. Like they sort of have an idea that manufacturing is improving, but that's not visceral for them. But forgiving student loans would have been. And so I think it's just like a lot of people are looking around and, seeing some elements of the political stagnation, especially as we go into an election year, seeing inflation not feel like it's going down, seeing a housing crisis, feeling like their wages have stagnated. And then, coming out the other side of the pandemic, I think there's a lot of mental health issues too. Like people are just feeling down in general. So of course they're going to be feeling down about the economy. I think there's an element of social media as well. TikTok sort of exacerbating different narratives around what is good versus what is bad. I think there's just too much information out there and it's really hard to parse out what's the truth. But I don't know if people's reality is divorced from what's actually happening. I think that most people have a general sense of what's going on. But I do think that people tend to feel worse about their situation than maybe they should. But the fact that they feel bad is something to take very seriously. But it's just difficult to parse out why they're feeling bad because there are so many different factors.
Yeah, I guess a kind of interesting question that raises is about the way that we measure the economy and the data that we traditionally look toward. And then, what we're seeing in the public sentiment. So, I think the Biden administration argument is that, hey, look around, unemployment's really low, wages are going up, GDP's growing at a rate much higher than a lot of economists expected. It sort of looks like this soft landing, this mystical, magical thing that everybody said was totally impossible is maybe now kind of happening by the traditional ways that we measure it. And yet the sentiment is really bad. And so something that I've written about is like maybe we shouldn't just be looking at GDP to measure the economy. Maybe we should be asking people different questions about, are you in debt? Did you have trouble paying your rent this month? Do you feel like you're being paid as much as you should at work? There are different kind of measures that I think we could, I guess, put into place to make that a more official, maybe government data point. So I'm curious, like Kyla Scanlon, how would you measure, the economy? What kind of data would you look at to get a good idea of how things are? And would you maybe change the measurements we have?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I'm writing this book about the economy right now, and I have a whole chapter on GDP. And the end of the chapter is like GDP sucks because it does from a lot of different angles, right? Like number one, measurement wise, it's fine, like, economic output, whatever. But it forms people into consumers, right? Like consumer spending, all that stuff. And so I think when you measure the economy based on how much money people are spending on various things, that's like fine. But I do think there are better ways to get a sense of how people are feeling. And I don't know if GDP accurately does that. I do think that there's questions like you're talking about, like, how much are you paying on rent? Like, how strapped do you feel paying on rent? Like, do you feel like you can afford rent? Do you feel like you can afford groceries? All of that stuff. But I do think it's not even like how we measure the economy, because a lot of those metrics some of them are survey based, and that's like impossible, especially with the jobs market. But I think it really just comes down to how do we sort of redefine the economy for people, especially in terms of housing. So if you look at a wealth breakdown of the United States, the bottom 50%, all of their wealth is tied into their homes. And so of course they're going to be very attached to the idea, number one, of getting a home and be very frustrated if they can't get a home. And then number two, not want more homes to be built around them because they want the value of their home to increase. But if you look at the top 10%, all of their wealth comes from equity ownership and business ownership. So owning stocks and then owning a portion of their business. And so I think that in order for people to feel better, we have to like redefine what it means to feel better. And that can't be like having all your wealth tied into a house. Because part of the reason that people feel bad is because they don't feel like they have enough money. And so I think it really just comes down to like, how do we redefine what having enough money means and help people get into the stock market maybe, or help people, do sort of employee stock option programs at various places like how Starbucks has, where people feel like an owner in the place that they work for and are able to benefit from the upside.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. I guess maybe a follow-up to that is you look around this sort of economists, commentariat space, other people who are talking about the economy, opinion makers, folks like that. Is there like maybe one or two things that you've seen over the last few years that sort of makes you want to rip your hair out? I mean, what are they missing? Because it strikes me that you seem like an alternative voice in a lot of the stuff that I read. And I guess I'm curious if there are things that you see maybe being accepted as common wisdom or common sense from the kind of economists that a lot of people spend reading Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, whatever, or if there's just a sort of narrative arc you're watching right now that is frustrating for you as somebody who maybe views things differently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't I don't know if it's economic commentators specifically, but media headlines have gotten very negative, as I know you're probably aware of. And I feel like that is super harmful for how people interpret the economy. Like things like quiet quitting, the great resignation, doom spending, funflation, all of those are so reductive and it's so insulting, I think, for people to hear those sorts of terms. And that's like something I really obviously I made a word called the vibe session, so I'm probably part of the issue. But I do think that there is something going on with media exacerbating all of these issues, not to be like big media bad, but I do think that's something that we have to pay attention to is the negative sentiment that's generated by these economic headlines. It's felt really viscerally by people because like you're not going to, a lot of people don't read the articles, they just read the headlines. And if you read an article that says you're causing inflation by having fun with your friends, you're gonna be like, this is stupid. I feel bad. I hate everything. And so that's something that I'm kind of paying attention to is how the narrative is shaped in the economy and how we can sort of fix it, right? And make people feel like the economy is something that they can be a part of and participate in because they have to, right? And it's like, how do you make it so it doesn't feel like this big scary thing that's being described in obscure terms, right?
Yeah, I guess tied to that is sort of the audience that I see you talking to a lot. I mean, I think just in doing background for this interview, one of the things, constant themes that I see is a sort of recognition of the fact that you're kind of educating a lot of Gen Z consumers about the economy. I'm curious if maybe you could talk about A, why you're talking to that generation, or if you intended to, and B, how the presence on social media, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, places like that, has helped you, grow your message and get your work out there, because it seems like a really important part of your story that's kind of where you're winning right now.
Yeah. So the reason I talk to Gen Z is I guess I am one. I'm a cusper. So I was born in 97. So I'm part of that demographic. And I just think like, I don't know, my whole thing with the work that I do, and it's separate than the economy at large, is that if people feel like they're not a part of the economy and they feel like they can't understand the economy, that doesn't enable them to make good decisions. Like I really think that in order to make good decisions about things, you have to understand what interest rates are and what the Federal Reserve is. And so that's my whole goal, is like just giving people an accessible place where they can go and learn about those things, hopefully in like a fun way. And then I think with social media, the reason I'm on every single platform ever is because you have to meet people where they are. And attention spans are so short. The life cycle is really short too, that you just have to meet them. And if it helps one person, like that's good enough. But one thing that I've found with the content is that if people tune in, like I've been doing this for 2 years now, like if people tune in for a couple months, they kind of learn just from osmosis with some of the concepts that I talk about. And so I think it's just like you just have to be in front of them as much as you can be. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious. I mean, do you feel like there's a difference between the audience and the way they interact with your work on TikTok versus on Substack or YouTube or Twitter? Like, how do you sort of see the way your commentary plays out differently across those spaces? Because it feels to me like it'd probably be a little bit of a different audience, and maybe, maybe on Twitter, people are, I mean, I guess I'm speaking to my perception now, but like for me, Twitter is like, put something up there if you want to get yelled at and corrected and people get upset. I don't have a TikTok account, but I know from writing a newsletter like you do, and I started out on Substack, is that the responses there always seem a lot more thoughtful and maybe more intimate. So I'm wondering like how that plays out for you across the platforms in your experience.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is good from a discoverability perspective. Obviously, it's changed under leadership, and I haven't found it to be as useful for me personally. But that's where I go to learn from others, is Twitter, because like so many economists are on there giving their opinion loudly. And then with Substack, it's really special because I don't know, it's just like a nice way to interact with people. Like the comments are always really friendly. Same with YouTube. Like if people are tuning in for a blog post or a long video, normally they're there to learn certain things. With TikTok, it's a little bit more inflammatory. People like to have conspiracy theories on there. Instagram Reels is pretty similar. And then, yeah, like podcast platforms, you really interact with the audience as much. But I would say, like, yeah, each of them offers something unique, and it's always really fun to be able to talk to people, because that's like why you do what you do, right? Is why you make content, is to help people. And it's cool to hear from them and to hear what they need.
Yeah, totally. So I know you mentioned, you're a cusper, and I don't want to ask you to speak for an entire generation of people, but as a millennial, I remember what it was like when I was a young reporter, and people asked me to do that a lot. But I am curious to hear a little bit about how you think maybe Gen Z is misconstrued in the media, and maybe especially through like an economic lens. You published, I think it was maybe your last piece, but I thought a great newsletter about this viral video, which I'm sure some of our readers have seen and some haven't. But basically, it was some Gen Z woman who was at home in her apartment, and she was kind of crying and recording herself on TikTok talking about her day, and just saying, she's commuting to work 2 hours each way or something like that. It's this 9 to 5 job. She has no time for social life. She doesn't really like her job. She was feeling very trapped and upset. And then there was just sort of this explosion of non-Gen Z commentary around it that was like, oh, look at this classic Gen Z person who's just totally like is not capable of working a 9 to 5 job and having a breakdown about like a very normal life most Americans live. And I thought you did a really effective job of sort of deconstructing why that argument sucked, and kind of dunking on a lot of the people who were making it in a really lazy way. So I'm kind of curious to hear you talk a little bit about that, and maybe tie it into, I'm assuming, what you probably view as a theme of the way Gen Z is often misconstrued in the media like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what really that video boiled down to was her being like, why is it this way? And then everybody being like, it's this way because it's this way, and you have to accept it. And I do think, like you said, that's super lazy. Like, it's like, we can imagine a better world, and like, it doesn't have to be this way. Like, there can be improvements. And so that was kind of the whole impetus of that piece, was just talking about how Gen Z relates to work. And I wrote this piece for Fast Company earlier this year talking about the same thing. It's this idea that work doesn't have to be the way that it's always been. Like, the 9 to 5 is technically a relic of the Industrial Revolution. Like, if you look at chronotypes, some people work really well in the mornings and they shut down after 2 p.m. Some people are night owls. And I just think the way that we think about work has to evolve to some extent. And that's sort of what that piece was talking about, is like, it doesn't always have to be the way that it is. And I think, and this is how it is with every generation. Like, every generation has always been the ones who don't want to work. This is not a new theme. Boomers went through it, millennials went through it, whatever. But I think for the first time, in the millennial generation is experiencing this too, the promise of the American dream does not exist, right? Like, it is almost impossible to get a house, especially with mortgage rates being where they're at. A 9 to 5 wage income doesn't go how it used to. You can't really support a family on it like you used to be able to. You also don't work for the same corporation for 40 years, so you don't have that sense of security and that sense of community that a lot of people used to get from their jobs. And so I think, everything is changing within the structure of the work, and so it makes sense that the work itself is going to change. I don't know what that looks like, right? Like, I'm not an oracle, but I do think that what she was saying was super valid. And the fact that people were dunking on her means they felt the same way. Like, there was this one person who was like, this girl is so stupid. And then somebody was like, why do you think that? And this person responded to them. And the person was like, I feel the same way, but she's stupid. It's like, what's going on here? Why are we so dunk heavy all the time? I don't know. It's, yeah, I would say that's sort of my thoughts on it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it kind of ties into this general theme that, there's this new generation coming up that is a lot less attached to, working hard to get what they want than the previous generations were, which I think a lot of people like to look at that and frame it as being antithetical to the American experience. And, this is like a threat to the economy, honestly. I mean, that is how a lot of people talk about it. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe that perception of Gen Z, and, how we actually, I guess, from the data, what we can actually conclude about that generation as far as, being a workforce and a group of educated Americans. Like, well, what does the data actually say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something called financial nihilism going on. Millennials do this too, where it's kind of like, okay, like I don't think that I'm going to be able to achieve what previous generations were able to achieve. Therefore, I'm going to spend my money. I'm not going to save. I'm going to save a little, but not a lot. And so I think we see a lot of that. And then I think that we see people just kind of get frustrated and do job hopping. In terms of the data itself, like people are still working. Like the labor force participation rate has basically recovered from the 25 to 54-year-old age group. Obviously, some Gen Zers are younger than 25, most of them actually. But I do think like people are still working. They're still getting jobs. They're still out there doing things. I think it's just like a desire to do things differently. And I think that employers have to take that seriously. Like ever since that Fast Company piece, I've gotten a lot of emails asking me how to manage Gen Z workforce. And I don't know, because they're like, well, they never show up on time. They never care. And I think solving the passion crisis is like a whole separate issue than fixing work. But the two are intertwined, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I know you have a book. It sounds like you have to finish today, which is totally insane. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I guess maybe one final question to leave you with is what you're keeping an eye on the next few months. What do you feel like is a big story or a couple of big stories in the economy that you're going to be watching closely right now, given, as we said at the top, just how kind of crazy everything is right now and all the different things that are in the air and going on? What are you focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think always sentiment. I'm always watching sentiment, very interested in how people feel about the economy. And then nostalgia is something I'm very interested in and how that shapes so many things about the economy. Marvel Cinematic Universe, sort of endless movie repeats and sequels and prequels and maybe nothing new being invented, and how that bleeds into our imagination and how that bleeds into hope. So sort of like the culture aspect of the economy. And then, how people are feeling. Because at the end of the day, people are the economy and that's all that matters. So those are the two things I'm looking at.
All right. Kyla Scanlon, people want to keep up with your work. Where's the best place for them to do that?
Yes. So I have a Substack, kyla.substack.com. I have a podcast called Let's Appreciate that's on all podcast platforms. I'm on TikTok. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter at Kyla Scan. And then I have a YouTube channel as well.
Awesome. Yeah, you're doing it all right now. It's pretty impressive.
And a book. I have a book coming out in April 2024. So
love it.
Yes,
Kyla, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it. And let's keep in touch.
Thanks. Yeah.